Standard deviation and variance are measures of dispersion in return. A standard deviation is a square root of variance. It quantifies the degree to which returns fluctuate around their average. A, a higher value of standard deviation means higher risk. जब भी ये स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन जो पोर्टफोलियो का होता है अगर हायर है तो इसका मतलब ये होता है कि जो आपका पोर्टफोलियो का रिस्क है वो ज़्यादा है. इट मीन्स ये भी होता है कि आपके जो पोर्टफोलियोज़ हैं वो वॉलेटाइल होंगे. स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन इज यूज्ड probably more than any other measures to describe the risk of a security or portfolio of securities in any academic study on investment performance. Chances are that a standard deviation will be used to gauge risk. It's not just a financial tool though. A standard deviation is one of the most commonly used statistical tools in the science and social science. It provides a precise measure of the amount of variance in any group of numbers. The returns of a mutual fund, rainfall in Mumbai, or weight of professional cricket players. A standard deviation. One of the strengths of a standard deviation is that it can be used across board for any type of portfolio with any type of securities. The calculation is the same for a portfolio of a bond as it is for a portfolio of growth stock or any other type of investment. A standard deviation is interpreted as follows. Suppose the investment portfolio has a monthly standard deviation of 3.27%. Suppose the expected return for the same is 2%. This means in future there is 66.7% probability that portfolio return would be between mean return plus and minus 1 sigma, that is 2% minus 3.27% to 2% plus 3.27%, where 3.27% is 1 into 3.27%. इसका मतलब ये है कि स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन का मतलब होता है कि एक लिमिट फिक्स कर दी गई कि मतलब 2% माइनस 3.27% नीचे के लेवल तक आ सकता है और 2% प्लस 3.27% एक कैप प्रोवाइड कर देता है कि इतना डेविएट हो सकता है आपका पोर्टफोलियो या फिर आपका जो भी इन्वेस्टमेंट है. देयर इज़ 95% प्रोबेबिलिटी दैट द पोर्टफोलियो रिटर्न वुड बी बिटवीन मीन रिटर्न प्लस and minus 2 sigma, that is 2% minus 6.54% to 2% plus 6.45%, where 6.54% is 2 into 3.27%. There is 99% probability that the portfolio return would be between mean return plus and minus 3 sigma 2% minus 9.81% to 2% plus 9.81%, where 9.82 is 3 into 2.27%. A standard deviation allows portfolios with similar objectives to be compared over a particular time frame. It can also be used to gauge how much more risk a fund in one category has versus the others. Semi-variance, semi-standard deviation as a measure of downside risk. Semi-variance measures the dispersion of the return below the mean return. Target semi-variance measures the dispersion of the return below the target return. In case of symmetrical distributed return, semi-variance will be proportional to variance and provides no additional insights. Forecasting a symmetrical distribution of return is very difficult and may not be good forecast of future risk. Due to these reasons, semi-variance is not so popular used in practice. Portfolio risk versus individual risk. A standard deviation or variance of the returns is used as measure of risk. While computing portfolio risk, it is to be borne in mind that portfolio standard deviation is not the weighted average standard deviation of individual investment in a portfolio. Investment have perfect positive correlation with each other, which is practically an impossibility. Portfolio risk depends on the weights of the investment, their individual standard deviation, and more importantly, the correlation across those investment as shown in the formula below. आपके जो भी पोर्टफोलियो में है वो रिस्क डिपेंड करता है कि पोर्टफोलियो में जो आपके स्टॉक हैं, जो आपके एसेट्स हैं, उनका वेट क्या है, इंडिविजुअल स्टॉक्स का स्टैंडर्ड डिविएशन क्या है, बीटा क्या है, सेक्टर क्या है, सेक्टर के साथ कोरिलेशन क्या है. Systematic and unsystematic risk. Systematic risk is defined as a risk due to common risk factor like interest rates, exchange rate, commodity prices. It is like linked to supply and demand in various marketplaces. All investment get affected by these common risk factors directly or indirectly. Systematic risk cannot be diversified away. Though it can be hedged, systematic risk is measured by beta. सिस्टमेटिक रिस्क वो रिस्क है जिसको आप डाइवर्सिफाई नहीं कर सकते हैं, इसको हेज कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि ये जो रिस्क होता है ना ये अनडाइवर्सिफाइबल है. ये इंटरेस्ट रेट की वजह से हो सकता है, एक्सचेंज रेट्स की वजह से हो सकता है, फेड ने कुछ कर दिया या फिर आरबीआई ने कुछ रेट कट्स कर दिए, कोविड आ गया, तो ये कोविड आ गया या फिर जो 2008 का लेमन क्राइसिस था उसकी वजह से हो गया, तो ये अनसिस्टमेटिक रिस्क है. ये एक्चुअली सिस्टमेटिक रिस्क है. अनसिस्टमेटिक रिस्क जो होता है वो सेक्टर वाइज होता है, कंपनी वाइज होता है. कंपनी में कोई घोटाला हो गया, जैसे आइडिया में हुआ था 10%. एक्चुअली आइडिया का एक न्यूज़ था तो उसकी वजह से फ्राइडे को 11% गिरा हुआ था, 10-11%. तो ये अनसिस्टमेटिक रिस्क है. रिस्क ड्यू टू सेक्टर स्पेसिफिक, कंपनी स्पेसिफिक factors is referred as unsystematic risk. This these risks can be diversified away. Alpha return is a reward for bearing unsystematic risk. Beta. Systematic risk is measured by beta. Beta relates the return of a stock or portfolio to the return on market index. It reflects the sensitivity of the fund's return to fluctuation in the market index. Beta calculation requires two series of values for a reasonable long period of time, say 3 to 5 years. First series in your portfolio daily, weekly, monthly prices. The second series would be the market index on all the dates for which the market's prices of your portfolio has been considered. Beta covariance uh, into market return divided by portfolio. The relationship between the beta of an individual security with portfolio of security is linear. Beta of the portfolio can also be calculated by taking the weighted average beta of the individual securities investment in the portfolio. Thus, if stock A has a beta of 1.2 and a stock B has a beta of 1.1 and they make up the portfolio in the ratio of 60-40, the beta of the portfolio would be beta 0.6 into 1.2 plus 0.6 into. Okay, beta is fairly easy to interpret. A beta that is greater than 1 means that the portfolio or stock is more volatile than the benchmark index, while a beta of less than 1 means that the security is less volatile. आपके जो पोर्टफोलियो का बीटा है, अगर बीटा जो है वो 1 प्लस है, मतलब मोर देन 1 है, तो इसका मतलब है कि जो आपका पोर्टफोलियो है, पोर्टफोलियो में जो आपके सिक्योरिटीज़ हैं, इन्वेस्टमेंट है, इक्विटीज़ हैं, वो वॉलेटाइल हैं और उनका जो कोरिलेशन है वो इंडेक्स के साथ उतना अच्छा नहीं है. तो जो लेस देन 1 होता है ना उसको अच्छा माना जाता है अगर बीटा लेस देन 1 है तो. Tracking error. Tracking error is the standard deviation of the difference between the portfolio and its target benchmark portfolio return. Generally indices are used to benchmark portfolio. Tracking error उसको कहा जाता है कि सपोज आपका जो इन्वेस्टमेंट है, आपकी जो पोर्टफोलियो है वो नेगेटिव में चल रही है और जो इंडेक्स है वो पॉजिटिव में चल रहा है. आपका जो पोर्टफोलियो है वो 10% रिटर्न दे रहा है और जो इंडाइसेस हैं वो 12 से 15% का रिटर्न दे रहे हैं, तो उसको ट्रैकिंग एरर कहा जाता है. लोअर द ट्रैकिंग एरर, क्लोजर आर द रिटर्न्स ऑफ द पोर्टफोलियो टू द टारगेट इंडेक्स. If the benchmark portfolio is the market portfolio, tracking error measures deviation from the market return. Tracking error is always calculated against the total return index, which shows the returns on the index portfolio inclusive of dividend. Tracking errors primarily see due to mismatch between portfolio's risk profile and the benchmark's risk profile. Risk adjusted return. The differential return earned by the portfolio manager may be due to difference in the exposure to risk. Hence, it is imperative to adjust the return for the risk. The following are popularly used risk adjusted return measure. These risk adjusted performance measures uses the performance of a fund in terms of return per unit of risk. शार्पे रेशियो, शार्पे रेशियो काफ़ी फेमस है, इससे बहुत सारे क्वेश्चंस भी आते रहते हैं. वन अप्रोच इज़ टू कैलकुलेट पोर्टफोलियोज रिटर्न इन एक्सेस ऑफ द रिस्क फ्री रिटर्न एंड डिवाइड the excess return by the portfolio's standard deviation. One approach is to calculate portfolio's return in excess of the risk-free return and divide the excess return by the portfolio's standard deviation. This risk-adjusted return is called Sharpe ratio. This ratio, named after William Sharpe, it measures reward the variability. A Sharpe ratio is equal to RP minus RF divided by standard deviation of portfolio. Return ऑफ द पोर्टफोलियो माइनस रिस्क फ्री रिटर्न. तो रिस्क फ्री रिटर्न उसको कहा जाता है जैसे फिक्स्ड इनकम ट्रेजरी मतलब बॉन्ड्स हो गए या फिर इन्फ्लेशन हो गया. तो इन्फ्लेशन जैसे सपोज 6% है, ट्रेजरी बिल जो बॉन्ड्स है वो गवर्नमेंट बॉन्ड्स वो 7% का रिटर्न दे रहे हैं, तो यहाँ पे 7% का रिटर्न माना जाता है. It is to be noted that these three variables should be for the same period. Generally, annualized return and annualized standard deviation is taken for computing Sharpe ratio of the portfolio for easy comparison across portfolios. Suppose the annualized standard deviation of the portfolio is 6.5%. Suppose that the annualized return for the same portfolio is 10.5%. The risk-free rate of return is 5.5%. Then the Sharpe ratio of the portfolio is 10.5% minus 5.5%. तो अभी यहाँ पे जैसे फॉर्मूला था रिटर्न ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो, तो रिटर्न ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो 10.5 है, रिस्क फ्री रेट ऑफ रिटर्न जो है वो 5.5 है और डिवाइडेड बाय स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो. तो ये जो टोटल निकल के आएगा वो 0.7692. दिस सजेस्ट दैट द फंड हैज़ जनरेटेड 7692 परसेंटेज point of return above the risk-free return for each percentage point of a standard deviation. The Sharpe ratio is measure of relative performance. It enables investor to compare across investment opportunity. Higher the Sharpe ratio, better is the portfolio's risk adjusted. Higher the Sharpe ratio, better is the portfolio's risk adjusted performance. A fund with a higher Sharpe ratio in relation to another is preferable as it indicates that the fund has generated return for every unit of risk. It can be noted a ratio adjusted return to the total portfolio's risk. Hence, it is a useful measure of performance for several mutually exclusive portfolio. The Sharpe ratio is the simplest measure to compute, and that is why it is the most widely used risk adjusted return measure. However, it has a disadvantage. It ignores diversification potential of portfolio. The Trainer ratio. The Trainer measures adjust excess return for systematic risk. It is computed by dividing a portfolio excess return by its beta shown in इक्वेशन. पोर्टफोलियो रिटर्न इसका ट्रेनर का है कि आर पी माइनस आर एफ डिवाइडेड बाई बीटा ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो. वहाँ पे था शार्पे में कि आर पी माइनस आर एफ डिवाइडेड बाई स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो. ठीक है. As can be seen, the numerator of the equation remains the same as in case of Sharpe ratio. The denominator standard deviation is replaced by beta. As can be seen, the numerator of the equation remains the same as in case of Sharpe ratio. The denominator standard deviation is replaced by beta. Suppose in the above case, beta of the fund is precisely 1. The Trainer ratio of the fund would be 10.5 minus 5.5 divided by 1 is equal to 0.5. This indicates that the fund has generated 0.05 percentage point excess return for every unit of systematic risk. Like SARPE ratio, it is measure of relative performance. It enables investor to compare across investment opportunities. A fund with a higher trainer ratio in relation to another is preferable, as it indicates that the fund has higher risk premium for every unit of market risk. As trainer ratio indicates return per unit of systematic risk, hence it is a useful measure of performance if an investor wishes to evaluate a portfolio in combination with other actively managed portfolio. अभी सार्पे वर्सेस ट्रेनर देखते हैं. सार्पे रेशियो यूजेज a standard deviation of return as the measure of risk, where trainer performance measure uses of beta especially is. For a completely well diversified portfolio, the two measure gives identical ranking because total risk and systematic risk would be the same. However, for a poorly diversified portfolio, the ranking based on trainer ratio could be higher than that on SARPE ratio, as trainer ratio ignores unsystematic risk. Thus, any difference in ranking based on SARPE ratio and trainer ratio is due difference in portfolio diversification level. SARPE ratio is more suitable to evaluate our portfolio performance for an investor who has not achieved adequate diversification on his wealth as a whole, and trainer ratio should be used for investors who hold their wealth in well diversified portfolio. Next आता है Sortino ratio. For computing Sortino ratio, portfolio's return in excess of risk-free return is divided by portfolio's semi-standard deviation. सार्पे में था कि RP माइनस RF डिवाइडेड बाई स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो. ट्रेनर में क्या है? RP माइनस RF डिवाइडेड बाई बीटा ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो. सॉर्टिनो में आ जाता है कि RP माइनस RF डिवाइडेड बाई सेमी स्टैंडर्ड डेविएशन ऑफ पोर्टफोलियो. Sortino adjusted portfolio excess return. This ratio may be very appealing to some investors who view risk as chances of losing money rather the uncertainty around expected return. Sortino ratio. Semi-standard deviation of the portfolios RP minus RF. Information ratio, appraisal ratio जिसको कहते हैं. If we wish to determine whether or not an observed alpha is due to a skill or chance, we can compute information ratio. IR is equal to RP minus RB divided by standard deviation RP minus RB. The information ratio, return on portfolio, return on benchmark. Okay, standard deviation is equal to RP minus RB. It's equal to a standard deviation of the difference between the return of the portfolio and return of the benchmark. The numerator in the ratio presents the fund manager's ability to use his skill and information to generate portfolios return that differ from the benchmark BSE sensitive index or Nifty 50, against which his performance is being measured. The denominator M2 measures. Franco Modigliani and his granddaughter Lee Modigliani 1997 derived another risk-adjusted performance measures. They adjusted the risk of the portfolios to match the risk of the market portfolio. For such a risk-adjusted portfolio, they calculated the return and compared it with the market return to determine portfolio's over or under performance. To adjust the risk of the portfolio, they resorted to leaving or deleveraging. After the standard deviation have been equalized, return can be directly compared with the return in the market. A high indicates that the portfolio has underperformed the market portfolio. Suppose the portfolio has generated a return of 35%, the market benchmark portfolio has generated a return of 28%, the treasury bill rate is 6%, the standard deviation of the portfolio is 42%, the standard deviation of the market portfolio is 30%. The hypothetically portfolio's market volatility 30 divided by 42. A standard deviation of the market portfolio divided by standard deviation of portfolio is equal to 0.714 in portfolio. So 1 minus 7 is equal to treasury bill. RP risk on portfolio risk since return on the hypothetical less the market on performance evaluation, benchmarking and peer group analysis. Performance evaluation is a relative concept. After measuring the performance, next important step is to evaluate it against some suitable benchmark or similar portfolios to address more important issues like how the returns measure up to the comparable investment opportunities. Performance evaluation also enables the investors to determine if the portfolio manager has enhanced the portfolio value beyond what could be obtained from a passive indexed strategy and whether the portfolio management fee are justified. Characteristic of indices for benchmarking. Gives defines benchmarks as an independent rate of return or hurdle rate, forming an objectives of objective test of the effective implementation of investment strategy. It is a standard or point of reference. It is a collection of investment opportunities or securities or risk factor which represents the investment characteristics and investment approach of the portfolio being evaluated against it. Indices make popular choices for benchmarking portfolio. The number and variety of available indices makes selection of suitable benchmarks as a daunting task. A good benchmark increases the proficiency of performance evaluation. Hence, while choosing an index as a benchmark, care should be taken to ensure that it is a representative of the portfolio. A good benchmark should be able to satisfy this, full these criteria. The identify of constituents and their weights in the benchmarks are clearly defined. The benchmark is investable. In other words, it is possible to have a passive exposure to the same. The benchmark is consistent with the portfolio's investment approach. For example, if the portfolio's investment approach is to invest in blue chip stock, the benchmark should also consist of blue chip stock. If the investment style of the portfolio is value investing, the benchmark should be of the same orientation. The benchmark is having the same risk return profile as the portfolio. The same performance of the benchmark is measurable. कहता है कि जिसको भी आप बेंचमार्क चूज़ कर रहे हैं उसके अंदर कुछ ये क्राइटेरिया होना चाहिए. बेंचमार्क जैसे आपका पोर्टफोलियो पीएमएस आपका ब्लू चिप में है तो जो बेंचमार्क आपका होना चाहिए वो ब्लू चिप का ही होना चाहिए. Customized benchmark. Sometimes market-based indices may not meet the above criteria of a good benchmark given the portfolio manager's investment strategies and style. Such situations demands for appropriate customized benchmark. When the portfolio manager follows a certain type of investment strategy and style, they create an investment universe reflecting the same to focus their research activities. The portfolio manager then select the most attractive securities from the investment universe. Such investment universe can act as a benchmark for portfolio evaluation when market-based indices are not found to be valid. The advantage of such benchmarks is that they meet the requirement of a valid benchmark. The disadvantage is that the cost of construction and maintenance of these benchmarks would be much higher than the fee paid for using market-based indices. Manager universe analysis. Manager universe analysis or peer group analysis is also a very popular way of conducting performance evaluation. The median portfolio or the universe of the portfolio manager with a similar investment approach and a strategy can be taken as a yardstick to evaluate the performance of the portfolio. Investors have a natural interest in knowing how their portfolio managers are performing compared to others. Portfolio tracking firms have developed a database to facilitate managers' universe analysis. They rank the portfolios with similar investment characteristic and risk return portfolio on same risk adjusted return measures. Performance attribution analysis. The second phase of performance evaluation of the performance attribution, there are different ways of doing the attribution analysis, but the one propounded by Pharma remains the dominant framework. The underlying theme behind various attribution analysis approaches is to dissect the return into majority two component, return driven by the benchmark and the differential return, and then identifying the quantifying the sources of differential return to primarily establish whether it was driven by skill of the portfolio manager or some random factors. In layman terms, luck. Assets under sector allocation. Differential return can be achieved by choosing to over invest in or overweight a particular economic sector that outperformed the total benchmark sector allocation for the period, or under invest in or avoid an assets category that underperformed the total benchmark assets allocation. It may be noted here that we are assuming that a particular sector is performing better or worse than the overall return of the benchmark of portfolio. Differential return can also be achieved by selecting securities that performed well relative to the benchmark or avoiding benchmark securities that performed relatively poor. One may note that the actual weight assigned by the fund manager have been taken here to weight on the excess return generated due to selection. This is logical because the actual investment has been made in the actual proportion only. Local currency versus foreign currency denominated investment return. An Indian investor who buys and sells securities that are denominated in currency other than the Indian rupee need to calculate the return after adjusting fluctuation in Indian rupees against those foreign currencies, as the return earned on investment denominated in foreign currencies would not be the same when converted back to rupees them term. The fluctuation in currency values can either enhance or reduce the return associated with foreign investment. This is called currency risk. Consider the following scenario. An Indian investor who has invested 50 lakhs in US equity fund when rupees was 70 per US dollar. The fund has generated a return of 15% during the period rupee appreciated to 65 per US dollar. What is the return investor has made? Capital investment in US based equity is 71,428 dollars. Investment value 71,428 into 15% plus yeah it 71,428.57 into 15% plus 71,428, तो ये आ गया 82,142.2855. ठीक है, अब $82,000 इंटू 142.86 इंटू 65, उसका जो डिफरेंस रहेगा 53,000. तो रिटर्न इन रुपीज़ टर्म्स 53 lakhs 39,000 to 85 minus 50 lakhs, यानी 3,39,285 का, that is return made in 6.79% and not 15%. Wow, that's great. Performance reporting to the investor. As SEBI portfolio manager is regulations state the following regarding performance reporting to the investor. The portfolio manager shall furnish periodically a report to the client as agreed in the contract, but not exceeding a period of 3 months, and as and when required by the client, and such report shall contain the following details, namely the composition and the value of the portfolio, description of securities and goods, numbers of securities, value of each securities held in the portfolio, units of goods, value of goods, cash balance, and aggregate value of the portfolio as on the date of report. कह रहा है कि परफॉर्मेंस रिपोर्टिंग टू द इन्वेस्टर, मतलब जब ये परफॉर्मेंस की रिपोर्टिंग देगा तो क्या क्या होना चाहिए. सेबी पोर्टफोलियो मैनेजर रेगुलेशन स्टेट द फॉलोइंग, मतलब ये होना चाहिए. परफॉर्मेंस जब दे रहा है तो उसके कुछ डिटेल्स होनी चाहिए, जैसे कि सिक्योरिटीज़ कितनी है, नंबर्स ऑफ सिक्योरिटीज़ कितनी है, उनका वैल्यूएशन कितना है, पोर्टफोलियोज़ का वैल्यूएशन कितना है, कितने यूनिट्स ऑफ सिक्योरिटीज़ हैं, ट्रांजेक्शन अंडरटेकन ड्यूरिंग द पीरियड ऑफ रिपोर्ट इंक्लूडिंग डेट ऑफ ट्रांजेक्शन एंड डिटेल्स ऑफ परचेज एंड सेल्स. सारे डिटेल्स रहने चाहिए कि कब बाई किया है, कब सेल किया है, कितनी क्वांटिटी, किस डेट को. ओके, ट्रांजेक्शन डिटेल्स. बेनिफिशियल इंटरेस्ट रिसीव्ड ड्यूरिंग द पीरियड इन द फॉर्म ऑफ इंटरेस्ट, डिविडेंड, बोनस, शेयर्स. अगर कुछ इंटरेस्ट, डिविडेंड, बोनस वगैरह मिला है तो उसके डिटेल्स. एक्सपेंस इनकर्ड इन मैनेजिंग द पोर्टफोलियो ऑफ द क्लाइंट, डिटेल्स ऑफ रिस्क फोरसीन बाय द पोर्टफोलियो मैनेजर एंड द रिस्क रिलेटिंग टू द सिक्योरिटीज रिकमेंडेड बाय द पोर्टफोलियो मैनेजर फॉर इन्वेस्टमेंट और डिस इन्वेस्टमेंट. अगर पोर्टफोलियो मैनेजर ने कुछ रिकमेंडेशन किया है कि बाई या सेल करने के लिए, तो वो उसके सारे डिटेल्स होने चाहिए. Default in payment of coupons or any other default in payments in the underlying debt securities and downgrading to default rating by the rating agency if any. अगर पेमेंट ऑफ कूपन्स और एनी अदर डिफ़ॉल्ट इन पेमेंट हुआ है तो सिक्योरिटीज़ एंड डाउनग्रेडिंग टू डिफ़ॉल्ट रेटिंग बाय द रेटिंग एजेंसी. अगर उसका कोई मतलब जैसे रेटिंग वगैरह कुछ डाउनग्रेड हुआ है, अपग्रेड हुआ है, तो वो भी बताना पड़ेगा. डिटेल्स ऑफ कमीशन पेड टू डिस्ट्रीब्यूटर फॉर द पर्टिकुलर क्लाइंट. Portfolio managers shall present the time-weighted rate of return of the investment approach along with the trailing return of the selected benchmark when communicating, advertising, publishing, mentioning performance of an investment approach. Portfolio managers shall present the extended internal rate of return for each investment approach the investor invest in when reporting performance to an investor. This shall be accompanied by the minimum, maximum, and median return generated across all investors in each of the IA the investor has invested in. The valuation of, please note that the performance of your portfolio may vary from that of the other investor and that generated by the investment approach across all investor because of the timing of inflows and outflows of fund and difference in the portfolio composition because of restriction and other constraint. Valuation of securities by portfolio manager. APMI shall prescribe a standardized valuation norms for portfolio manager. Valuation of the portfolio debt and money market securities by portfolio manager shall be carried out in accordance with these standardized valuation norms prescribed by APMI. APMI shall empanel valuation agency for the purpose of providing securities level prices to portfolio manager. Portfolio manager shall mandatory use valuation services obtained Due diligence and portfolio manager selection. Selecting a portfolio manager is a complex process. It involves analyzing a lot more than just returns. Investors are expected to carry out a detailed due diligence process before selecting the portfolio manager. Due diligence involves through quantitative and qualitative analysis of the portfolio manager's reputation, key personnel, and operations. Investors should understand the investment process, investment strategies, investing styles to appreciate how the investment returns are generated and gauge the likelihood of the performance persisting in future for the given investment process. The first step in selecting the portfolio manager is to draft the investment policy statement and determine the assets allocation. Then it becomes easier to select the portfolio manager who offers the best means to implement or express those decisions. Portfolio managers can be evaluated on the basis of their investment philosophy, investment approach, investment process, strategy, style, and past performance compared against a benchmark or manager universe. Attention can also be paid to the measure provision in the contract with the portfolio manager. Of course, the management fee and the cost will be a crucial factor too in evaluating the portfolio manager. Global investment performance standard. The global investment performance standards provide the investment community with a set of ethical standards for investment management firms to follow when presenting their performance results to potential clients. The standard serve to provide greater uniformity and comparability among investment managers without regard to geographic location and to facilitate a dialogue between investment manager and their prospective clients about the critical issues of how the managers achieved historical performance results and future investment. These standards are broadly accepted and endorsed by the investment management industry. For example, GIPS mandates use of time-weighted rate of return. SEBI Portfolio Manager Regulation 2020 has also prescribed the use of time-weighted rate of return for communicating the past performance. GIPS advertisement guidance. The GIPS advertising guidelines attempt to serve as an industry global best practice for the advertisement of performance result. The GIPS advertising guidelines do not replace the GIPS standard, nor do they absolve from presenting performance presentation that adhere to the requirement of the full GIPS standards. The guidelines only apply to the firm that already satisfy all of the requirements of the standards on a firm-wide basis and claim compliance with the standards. All advertisement that include a claim of compliance must include the following: a description of the firm, how an interested party can obtain a presentation that complies with the requirements of GIPS, and or list and description of all firm composites. The GIPS advertising guidelines compliance statement, a description of the strategy being advertised, period to date composite performance composite results for either or both of the following time period: 1, 3, and 5 years annualized composite performance return with the end of period date clearly identified. Periods of less than 1 year must not be annualized. The annualized returns must be calculated through the same period of time as presented in the corresponding complaint presentation. 5 years of annual composite performance return. If the annual return must be calculated through same period of time as presented in the corresponding complement presentation, whether performance is shown gross or net of investment management fee. The appropriate composite benchmark total return for the same period for which the composite return is presented from must also disclose the name and a description of the benchmark. The appropriate composite benchmark return is the same benchmark total return as presented in the corresponding compliant presentation. If no benchmark is presented, the advertisement must disclose why no benchmark is presented. The currency used to express performance. The description of the use and extent of leverage and derivatives. If leverage or derivatives are used as an active part of the investment strategy, that is not merely for efficient portfolio management of the composite. Where leverage derivatives do not have a material effect on return, no disclosure is required. When presenting non-compliant performance information for period prior to 1 January 2000 in an advertisement form, must disclose the period and which specific information that is not compliant, as well as provide the reason the information is not in compliance with GIPS standards. The measure of performance which divide the portfolio's risk premium by the portfolio's beta is tenor. What is the expected return of their stock portfolio described below? Sharpe performance measure the divides the portfolio risk premium by the standard deviation of the rate of return. Portfolio performance measured